Have you ever watched your own family celebrate your defeat before the judge even announced the verdict? I have. The courtroom was filled with quiet whispers and satisfied smiles. My relatives weren't nervous anymore. They were already shaking hands, hugging each other, and acting like they had won everything. To them, the verdict was just a formality. I looked across the room and realized something that hurt even more than losing the case. These were the people I once trusted. The people I had shared birthdays with, holidays with, and memories with. Now, they couldn't even hide how happy they were to watch me lose. The judge picked up the final papers and adjusted his glasses. The entire courtroom became silent. This was it. The moment that would decide who walked away with everything. Then my attorney slowly leaned toward me. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. He simply whispered 7 quiet words into my ear. For a second, I couldn't believe what I had just heard. Then I looked back at my family. One by one, their smiles disappeared. The laughter stopped. Even their lawyer suddenly looked confused. The judge paused before saying another word. In just a few seconds, the people who had been celebrating victory looked like they had seen a ghost. What were those 7 words? And how could a single sentence turn a guaranteed victory into complete silence? Stay with me, because what happened inside that courtroom changed my family's future forever. Section. Context/setup. To understand why those 7 words changed everything, you need to know how my family and I ended up in that courtroom. A year earlier, my life looked completely different. When my grandfather passed away, he left behind a large estate. It included the family home, several acres of land, and investments worth millions of dollars. Everyone believed his will was clear, and everyone expected the inheritance to be divided fairly. At least, that's what I believed. The days after his funeral felt strange. Instead of mourning together, my relatives started asking questions about money. Who would get the house? Who would control the business? Who would receive the largest share? It didn't take long before I realized they weren't interested in keeping the family together. They were interested in winning. At first, I tried to avoid arguments. I believed we could solve everything peacefully. Whenever someone accused me of being greedy, I stayed quiet. Whenever they ignored my calls, I told myself they just needed time. But things only became worse. Important family meetings happened without me. Lawyers were hired behind closed doors. Documents were discussed that I was never allowed to see. Every week, I felt more like a stranger in my own family. Then, one afternoon, I received official court papers. My own relatives were challenging my right to the inheritance. According to them, I had no legal claim. I remember reading those pages over and over again, hoping I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. The people who once called me family were now determined to remove me completely. Friends told me I should settle before the case destroyed my life. Some even said I should walk away while I still had my dignity. Maybe they were right, because as the months passed, every new hearing seemed to go against me. My family's lawyers looked confident. The evidence seemed to support their story. Even people sitting in the courtroom began acting as if the outcome had already been decided. By the time we reached the final hearing, almost everyone believed I had already lost. Almost everyone. Because there was one person who never stopped believing something didn't add up. My attorney. He rarely spoke about his strategy. He never made big promises. But every time I asked if we still had a chance, he gave me the same calm look and told me to trust the process. At the time, I had no idea why he sounded so certain. I was about to find out. Section. The 7 words change everything. The courtroom was so quiet that you could hear papers being turned. The judge looked down at the file one last time. My relatives were still smiling. One of my cousins even leaned over and whispered, "It's finally over." Their attorney had already started putting his documents back into his briefcase. To everyone in that room, the case was finished. Except for one man. My attorney. He slowly stood up, leaned toward me, and whispered 7 words that changed everything. The original will was just recovered yesterday. For a second, I couldn't even breathe. I stared at him, trying to understand what he had just said. The original will? I thought it had disappeared months ago. I thought every copy had already been examined. Without wasting another second, My attorney faced the judge. Your Honor, before the court delivers its final ruling, the defense has newly discovered evidence that directly affects the validity of this case. The entire courtroom froze. The judge stopped reaching for the verdict papers. The clerk looked up in surprise. Across the room, my family's smiles began to fade. Their attorney immediately stood up. Objection, Your Honor. But my attorney didn't back down. He calmly placed a sealed envelope on the judge's bench. It contains the original signed will, verified this morning, along with supporting authentication documents. You could almost feel the air leave the room. My uncle's face turned pale. My aunt looked at each family member as if she was searching for answers. No one spoke. No one moved. The judge carefully opened the envelope. He examined every page. Then, he compared the signatures with the copies already submitted to the court. Minute after minute passed. Nobody dared to say a word. Finally, the judge looked up. I will need to review this evidence before issuing any decision. Those words were enough. The celebration was over. The confidence was gone. The people who had walked into that courtroom expecting an easy victory were now sitting in complete silence, wondering how everything had fallen apart in just a few moments. And deep inside, I realized something. Those 7 quiet words hadn't just delayed the verdict. They had completely changed the future of the case. The courtroom was completely silent. The judge reached for the final papers, ready to announce the verdict. Across the room, my family looked relaxed. Some of them were already smiling. One of my cousins quietly whispered, "We finally won." Their lawyer had already started closing his briefcase. To everyone watching, the case was over, except for my attorney. He calmly leaned toward me and whispered 7 words that I will never forget. The original will has finally been found. For a moment, I couldn't move. I searched his face, wondering if I had heard him correctly. The original will? The one everyone believed had disappeared forever? Before I could ask another question, my attorney stood up. Your Honor, before the court issues its final ruling, the defense requests permission to present newly discovered evidence. The judge looked up immediately. The courtroom fell even quieter. My family's attorney was the first to react. Your Honor, this is highly unusual. But my attorney remained calm. It is unusual, he replied. That's exactly why this evidence must be reviewed before any verdict is announced. He walked to the bench carrying a sealed envelope. Every pair of eyes followed him. My uncle stopped smiling. My aunt looked nervous for the first time that day. Even their lawyer no longer looked confident. The judge carefully opened the envelope. Inside was the original signed will, along with documents proving where it had been discovered and how its authenticity had been verified. The judge examined each page slowly. Then, he compared the signatures with the copies already submitted during the trial. Seconds felt like minutes. Nobody dared to speak. The celebration that had filled the courtroom only moments earlier had completely disappeared. Finally, the judge looked up. I cannot issue a verdict until this evidence has been fully examined. My family's faces turned white. The victory they thought they already had was slipping away right in front of them. At that moment, I understood why my attorney had stayed so calm throughout the entire trial. He wasn't waiting for luck. He was waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. The judge asked everyone to remain seated. No one moved. The courtroom, which had been filled with quiet confidence only minutes earlier, now felt heavy with uncertainty. The original will was placed beside every copy that had been presented during the trial, page by page, signature by signature, date by date. The judge examined every detail with extreme care. Then he looked at both attorneys. Counsel approached the bench. For the next several minutes, the courtroom could hear nothing. The 3 of them spoke in low voices while everyone else waited. My family kept looking at each other. Their confidence was gone. No one smiled anymore. Finally, the judge returned to his seat. He looked directly at my family's attorney. Can you explain why this document was never disclosed to the court? The question hit them like a thunderbolt. Their attorney hesitated. He shuffled through his papers. He asked for a moment to review the evidence. But it was already too late. The judge had noticed something important. The signatures on the copies submitted by my family didn't perfectly match the original. There were small differences. Differences that had seemed impossible to notice before. But once the original appeared, they became impossible to ignore. Then another surprise came. My attorney presented a certified letter from the law office that had prepared my grandfather's estate years earlier. The letter confirmed that the original will had been placed in secure storage after it was signed. It had never been destroyed. It had never been replaced. And, according to the official records, no one had legal authority to alter its contents. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. My uncle slowly lowered his head. My aunt looked like she was about to cry. One of my cousins covered his face with both hands. For the first time since the trial began, they realized the truth. The case they believed they had already won had been built on incomplete evidence. The judge turned another page. Then another. Finally, he closed the file and removed his glasses. I have reviewed enough to understand that this court has not been presented with the complete facts. Those words changed everything. The courtroom wasn't just waiting for a verdict anymore. It was waiting for justice. And I could see it in my family's faces. They finally understood that the truth had caught up with them. The courtroom remained silent as the judge gathered every document into a single stack. No one dared to speak. My family sat perfectly still. Just an hour earlier, they had been smiling, whispering, and planning how they would divide the estate. Now, they couldn't even look at one another. The judge looked around the courtroom before finally speaking. After reviewing the newly submitted evidence, this court has reached its decision. My heart was pounding. It felt like every second lasted forever. Then the judge continued. The original will is legally valid and takes priority over every copy previously submitted to this court. A wave of silence swept across the room. The court finds that the distribution requested by the plaintiffs is not supported by the original document. My family's attorney slowly closed his eyes. He already knew what was coming next. The judge looked directly at me. The estate will be distributed according to the original will. Just like that, everything changed. The people who had walked into that courtroom expecting to celebrate their victory were now sitting in complete silence. My uncle stared at the floor. My aunt wiped tears from her face. One cousin quietly shook his head as if he still couldn't believe what had happened. No one celebrated. No one argued. No one even spoke. I turned toward my attorney. He simply smiled. Only then did I truly understand the 7 words he had whispered before the verdict. The original will has finally been found. Those weren't just 7 words. They were the truth my family had spent months hoping would never appear. They didn't win the case. They didn't expose anyone with a dramatic speech. They simply brought the truth into the courtroom. And once the truth arrived, everything else fell apart on its own. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I wasn't thinking about the money. I wasn't thinking about the estate. I was thinking about one lesson I would never forget. People can hide the truth for a while. They can celebrate too early. They can convince themselves they have already won. But sooner or later, the truth has a way of finding its voice. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Never assume you've lost just because everyone else says you have. Sometimes the truth stays hidden until the very last moment. And sometimes, all it takes is one piece of evidence, or 7 quiet words, to change everything. My family walked into that courtroom believing the case was already over. They celebrated before the verdict. But justice doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the facts. If this story kept you guessing until the very end, let me ask you something. What would you have done if you were sitting in my chair that day? Would you have given up? Or would you have trusted that the truth would eventually come out? Let me know your answer in the comments. I read as many of them as I can, and I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more powerful courtroom dramas, family betrayals, shocking inheritance battles, and true-to-life stories where justice always finds its way. And if you think this twist was unbelievable, wait until you hear the next story. Trust me, you won't see that ending coming either.